Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. Welcome to CSIS. My name is Victor Cha. I'm President of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department at CSIS and Professor at Georgetown. Thank you all for coming after a lovely Memorial Day weekend for our 5th CSDS-CSIS Transatlantic Dialogue on the Indo-Pacific. I want to thank my colleague Luis Simon, who's going to give some remarks, for bringing over his team. For our conversations, we had a private roundtable this morning and, of course, the public event this afternoon. So since we brought this group together for these conversations, a lot has really happened. There's been a lot that has happened. 2 wars in Europe and in the Middle East, a changing role for the United States in global policy, a much more assertive China, proliferation, tariff wars. A lot has happened that has really served to close the gap that used to exist between the way Europeans and Americans thought about the Indo-Pacific. And now I think it's fair to say, and it's certainly been the case in our conversations, that there are many things that, there are many issues upon which there's fruitful room for discussion between Europeans and Americans, not least of which are things like how to manage the challenge of the weaponization of economic interdependence in the global system today, the concerns about new groupings that are bringing Europe and Asia together today in ways that are not very productive, such as North Korea's role in Russia and the war in Ukraine. We're both grappling on both sides, both across the Pacific and across the Atlantic, in terms of how to respond to the United States and reciprocal tariffs, how to deter opportunistic aggression in the Indo-Pacific as well as in Europe, how to manage changes in U.S. force posture in the Indo-Pacific and the ripple effects that could have for Europe, and also the role of many of the minilateral groupings that have formed over the past 4 years, things like the Quad, trilaterals, the Indo-Pacific 4, IP4, and their connections to Europe-based groups like the G7 and NATO. So there has been plenty for us to discuss and that we will be discussing today. I'm going to give the stage over to my colleague Luis Simon to offer some opening remarks, and then we'll move right into the first panel discussion. So thank you again, all of you, for joining us today.
All right, thank you very much, Victor. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for hosting us again for this 5th edition of the CSIS-CSDS Transatlantic Dialogue on the Indo-Pacific. And I think last year we talked quite a bit about how China's role as a decisive enabler of Russia's war effort in Ukraine, but also North Korea's support, and you were talking about that, Victor, of Russia underscored the growing interdependence between the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific regions, and also the importance of greater cooperation between NATO and U.S. allies in the Indo-Pacific, especially Japan, but also ROK, Australia, and New Zealand. And I would say that all of that, as you were saying, Victor, remains relevant today. But of course, the strategic and political context keeps evolving. And we now have a new administration here in the United States with its own national security vision, and including its own vision on how the 2 theaters intersect. And we're also currently in the process of renegotiating the transatlantic relationship. And I think in this context, I would perhaps highlight 2 trends that I think are particularly relevant for our discussions on Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific. First, we see a push for European and Indo-Pacific allies coming from the United States to concentrate the bulk of their strategic attention and resources in upholding security and deterrence in their respective regions, and this is very much encouraged by the Trump administration, but my sense is that US allies, both in Europe and the Indo-Pacific, actually broadly share the need to prioritize their home regions. And second, and this is maybe a more US-specific trend, there's a greater emphasis on the need to establish a clear ranking of priorities with China, and perhaps more specifically, the challenge posed by China in the Indo-Pacific, as opposed to the global challenge, coming first and everything else being secondary or subsidiary. So I think taking these strategic and political trends as a point of departure, I would argue that any debate on whether cooperation between NATO and Indo-Pacific partners makes sense, and also on how to structure such cooperation, hinges on our ability to reconcile two seemingly contradictory pressures. On the one hand, NATO and its Indo-Pacific partners must ensure that their cooperation adds value from the perspective of bolstering our capabilities for deterrence and doesn't detract from our primary focus, which should be shoring up deterrence in our respective regions. And on the other hand, we also think about how cross-regional cooperation can add value in the context of how to cope with the various challenges posed by China. And I think there's a way to square that circle because NATO and US allies in the Indo-Pacific, I think, face a strikingly similar conceptual and operational problem, namely how to implement deterrence in their home regions, and specifically deterrence by denial. And I think that underscores the potential for synergies, particularly when it comes to articulating operational concepts, doctrines, capabilities, technologies, and standards geared for deterrence by denial. So I think if we move towards some sort of cross-theater deterrence ecosystem that takes us to common concepts, capabilities, technologies, and standards, we would also reduce the number of systems, platforms, and munitions, yielding also potentially significant gains in terms of efficiency, scale, and speed of delivery. So I think we've been talking about this morning, that we should perhaps embrace an approach to NATO and Indo-Pacific cooperation that respects also these priorities, namely the need to prioritize our respective regions, the centrality of China, and the importance of deterrence by denial and efficiency in terms of procurement. I think I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to Tom's speech, which you're going to introduce, I believe, and then to the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Luis. So to start us off, we're going to have our keynote address by Tom Wright. I think the last time we held this, Tom joined us in an off-the-record session when he was still in government, but now that he's out of government, he can speak to us on the record. Tom is Senior Fellow with the Strobe Talbot Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology at the Brookings Institution. As many of you know, he recently served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Strategic Planning at the National Security Council in the Biden administration. Most importantly, he's a graduate of Georgetown, where he did his PhD, so we're very, very proud of him for that. So let me turn the stage over to Tom. Tom's going to offer some reflections, and then he said that he'd be willing to take a few questions as well. So Tom, welcome back.
Victor, thank you for that very kind introduction. And Luis, thank you too. And it's great to be back here with your group and to be back here at CSIS. I came here regularly when I was at the National Security Council. I always really appreciated the engagement and always came away with some new and valuable insight. And I genuinely mean that. That helped me in my job day to day. I was asked to speak with you all about the future of European and Indo-Pacific security, which is not a small topic, I would say. But I do believe we are at a critical moment. Our adversaries and competitors are aligning at exactly the time when the United States and our allies are diverging, and consequently, that creates a significantly increased risk of a regional or global crisis or confrontation. To avert that, we will need to restore our cooperation with allies and encourage them to cooperate more closely together. Our adversaries and competitors have aligned bilaterally in profoundly important ways. Many of these bilateral relationships are alliances by almost any standard historically, short of the post-World War II standard that the United States and our allies in Europe and the Indo-Pacific set. And I think it's important to realize how and why that happened. After Russia invaded Ukraine, Moscow realized it was not strong enough to prevail on its own. It needed the help of others, so it sought to deepen its ties to its traditional partners, China, North Korea, and Iran. Russia asked North Korea for help in 2022, I think it was. I hesitate to say this in front of Victor because I'm sure he'll remember the dates more clearly than I do. But they did ask North Korea for help, and Pyongyang declined that call initially and would not give it weapons. So Russia upped its offer and promised to give more to get more, vital military and technology assistance to North Korea in exchange for artillery. And that greased the wheels. And by the end of our administration, North Korea was providing not just artillery, but also troops. Iran was giving drones and missiles, and China was helping Russia reconstitute its military industrial base on quite a rapid timeline. I call this strategic transactionalism, in that it is transactional between these powers, but it has a real strategic impact. And we are now seeing a level of military integration between these powers that enhances their individual and collective capabilities. Much is said of the Russia-China relationship. I can come back to that later on. But I would just say, in comparison to what we see and what I'll talk about next with the United States and our allies, you could make a case that the Russia-China relationship is the strongest bilateral relationship of any two countries in the world right now, bar none. This adversarial alignment, as we called it, was born more out of insecurity than out of strength and ambition. Each country worried about being able to compete with the United States and democratic allies elsewhere alone. Russia was running out of material in its war. Iran was under existential pressure, particularly after October 7th. China believed that it needed Russia, Putin's Russia, as a key partner and feared Putin's demise, partly in the war or maybe just generally. And North Korea saw a vital opportunity for economic improvement and military modernization. This alignment does not necessarily mean that they're going to coordinate aggression, but it does mean that all of our problems are made harder and more difficult. And it means that if a conflict were to break out, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, I don't think we can assume that other theaters would remain quiet or these other powers would remain out of that conflict. At precisely the time when we see this alignment, the United States is actually diverging from our allies. We in the Biden administration saw the Indo-Pacific and Europe as inextricably linked. One of the themes, one of the sort of catchphrases that we used in our documents and speeches was that you probably have heard many times before, is that we wanted to grow the connective tissue between the Indo-Pacific and Europe to make sure that we could all work together to shape the international order in a manner consistent with our values and interests. Just to take two examples of how that manifested itself, we saw significant support from our Indo-Pacific allies for Ukraine, and we saw crucial European assistance for technology export controls on China. Both of those wouldn't have happened if each set of allies just stuck to their own region. This thinking, it seems, no longer applies. To hear Trump administration officials talk, when they talk about strategic doctrine or their theory of the case, they usually say they want America's allies to concentrate purely on their own region, on deterrence in their own region, and not to be that involved in the other. They see limited value for united action globally. To be fair, there is a case to be made for the administration's point. If America's allies in each region are able to take on the burden of deterrence and security in their neighbourhood and not get distracted, maybe the alliances will be in a stronger shape down the road. But from Russia and China's perspective, it creates a significant vulnerability for us, an opportunity for them, because it represents a fracturing in the solidarity that has defined our alliance system. And there are also growing concerns about U.S. readiness, our ability to prepare for crises and contingencies, and also on our military strength and our defence budgets and our defence industrial base. Things are arguably even more concerning if you look at the president's actions himself. He strongly criticizes U.S. allies, not just in Europe and Canada, but he has also obviously imposed large tariffs, 10% tariffs on our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. And he has questioned the principle of territorial integrity that, of course, has underpinned the international order since World War II. While I strongly believe that we can compete with Russia and China while avoiding war, I do think we need to be honest that we're closer to a major crisis globally, arguably than any time since the early 1980s. That's not to say that war is inevitable. It is not. But it is to say that many of the conditions we see around the world, structural changes to do with the balance of power, the personalities of lots of the world's major leaders, and territorial disputes are certainly consistent with a pre-crisis environment. Taiwan remains the most likely flashpoint for a war between the United States and China, and those very real tensions that exist over Taiwan are now fused with technological competition, especially relating to the race on artificial intelligence, given the centrality of TSMC to that. It is as if, in some ways, as if West Berlin had the world's only supply of highly enriched uranium during the 1950s and the 1960s. If this crisis eventually comes, it may well come in unexpected ways. On April 1st and 2nd of this year, China carried out a massive maritime exercise called Straight Thunder 2025A, indicating there will be Cs and Ds potentially, drilling for a quarantine of Taiwan and attacks on its military installations. This is a signal that China may be preparing actions short of an invasion against Taiwan in the next few years. This contingency and others can only be addressed and averted if our allies in both regions and the United States work closely together to avert it. Even if short-term crises are averted, we will still also have the need to develop a long-term strategic advantage to shape the international order in ways that we would like. And we need to remember on that the world is not divided in two. Countries in the Global South have their own strategic logic and role to play. The Global South is a little bit like that term, the liberal international order. It's absolutely terrible and everyone agrees we shouldn't use it, but no one can quite come up with a brilliant alternative. So you'll forgive me for using it, but to me it means countries that do not neatly fall into either a US-led camp or China's. It covers a vastly diverse group of states, from democracies like Brazil and India to Southeast Asian states like Vietnam, to developing countries like South Africa and Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. These countries have a lot more divides them than they have in common, but I think they are important, and we do need to engage them on their own terms and not just through whichever strategic prism we have at a given point in time, be that great power competition or something else. But to engage them effectively, we really do need to do so with our allies and partners. Right now, there is no such approach. China, in particular, I think sees a real opportunity to push forward globally, diplomatically, because of America's retrenchment. And I think we will need to decide not just how we engage those countries, but also what we need to care about. All of these countries want to trade with China. Some of them want to trade with Russia. We can't object to that. We shouldn't object to that. But there are certain things that they may do, whether that's hosting a Chinese military base or engaging in maneuvers to surmount our export controls, where we may want to take a tougher stance. So I would just like to close briefly by looking toward the post-Trump world. because I think one of the things that we have learned from the re-election of the president for a second non-consecutive term is that the international order that we have known and that the United States has led for the past 30 years and arguably since World War II is over. And we can't just think in terms of a simple restoration if there's a change in leadership in the future. We will need to think about how to build something new, and that is our collective and shared intellectual project in some ways over the next 3.5 years that we will need to work on together. That will include questions like what type of international economic order can we build to replace not just the Trump tariff order, but also the order of the 1990s, which assumed a much more benign geopolitical world. What is the impact of reduced American security commitments on extended deterrence, particularly in Northeast Asia, but also in Europe? How can we protect critical national infrastructure such as telecommunications and key utilities from infiltration and sabotage by other powers, particularly major powers? And how can we strengthen our alliances and partnerships if the United States is likely in the future to oscillate between an internationalist policy that's more traditional and an America First policy and basically split the time evenly between the two? That's very distinct from the Cold War, where we saw a conservative and a liberal version of internationalism, both pro-alliance for many decades. And then finally, and we don't talk about that this much these days, but how can we tackle shared challenges like climate change, but also the challenges posed by artificial intelligence and other issues in the years ahead collectively with our allies and partners? So that's not quite an optimistic note to finish on, but I do think it's incumbent on those of us as we monitor very closely what the Trump administration is doing and look to the immediate crisis that we also look forward. And with that, Victor, I'll conclude, and I look forward to happy to take some questions and also look forward to the conversation. Thank you. Great. Yeah, just here. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Mark. I am from United Daily News, so based in Taiwan. So obviously, I'm going to ask about Taiwan. There's definitely a growing fear of conflict or invasion from China as we getting closer to 2027. And I'm just wondering, in your opinion, how close are Taiwan close to a conflict, and also how important is Taiwan to the United States, since Albert Colby don't think Taiwan as an existential existent interest to United States. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. You know, I think I'm always sort of worried about that, but right now I think I'm more worried about actions sort of short of an invasion. I think we need to think, just looking back at the PRC exercise, you know, from early April, we also need to think very hard about quarantine, blockade scenarios of lots of different types of variations. What I would say in the other part of your question is I think the United States has a very strong interest in the status quo in Taiwan and to oppose changes to that status quo whenever they come from, whether that's from China or from here or from Taiwan or from someplace else. But I think there are many reasons for that interest, some of them material, but also I think some of them to do with just, you know, our view of the importance of having a stable sort of international order and to preserve peace and security. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Nari Mira. I'm with the consulting firm in Japan. And my question to you is, Japan and South Korea are currently facing a political instability, with South Korea currently going through the presidential election. Japan is also headed for the upper house election in July. And I would like to hear your opinions or potentially like opportunities or challenges that U.S. may face in terms of bolstering the trilateral or bilateral alliance moving forward. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't really want to comment on the internal politics piece, but I would just say that I think the trilateral cooperation that we've seen over the last few years, I think it's been an incredibly sort of important force for good. I think there's a strong interest in the United States in continuing that. I think all three countries have a real interest in continuing that. And I think it is a force for stability, because I think as China sort of looks at it, you know, the more assertive or aggressive they are, the tighter our alliances become. And that, I think, is a dilemma for them. We would solve that dilemma, of course, if we were to stop deepening our alliances and were to pull back from them. And then that would suggest that there was a more permissive environment for provocative action. So, I believe there's a strong mutual interest in continuing that relationship. Back over here, and sorry, I don't want to miss over here either. I haven't over here in a minute, but here first.
Hi, Hi, my name is Alex Finn McCartney. I'm at George Washington University. You describe coming up with what the new order might look like as the main intellectual problem in the next couple of years, but as well as these challenges to alliances, the challenges to the structures, also comes with a challenge to that intellectual sort of structure, with the closure of many of the sort of traditional think tanks, many universities also under assault in these places. How do we also have a basis for defending that intellectual base to create something, to come up with ideas for what comes next?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think I'm, of course, concerned, as many people are, by what we see from, the administration against universities, and others. I do think that, setting that aside, I think, and coming out of government, I'm sure Victor also had that when he was in government too. When you come out, I think you do sort of think, are we doing the right thing to influence policy sort of in the right way? And the way I think about it is that we have a number of pretty intractable policy problems, that need answers, whether that's ways to protect critical infrastructure in this new geopolitical era, or the future of extended deterrence with a more conditional U.S. commitment, or the international economic order. And we need to be pretty disciplined about trying to answer those questions and convene the right groups of people to be able to answer those questions, to provide various answers to those questions over the next few years. And so I think we can do that independently of what the administration does or their view of us is. But I think the need for that is quite pressing and even urgent. Thanks. I think I saw some, yes, over here in the second row.
My name is Connor Pierce. I'm just an intelligence analysis student from JMU. You mentioned the severing of the connective tissue between our transatlantic partners. And you also mentioned how potentially we could be seeing an America that rapidly oscillates between an America first and more international policy. How do you think our European partners plan to adapt to this potential oscillation?
I would say awkwardly and one step at a time. I mean, I don't think anyone has a great answer to it, right? Because let's assume, that the Republican Party were to stay America first and quite skeptical of alliances. And let's assume that the Democratic Party were to remain pretty internationalist. If you look at every election since 1944, until the last time, basically it was split 40 years for one, 40 years for another, right down the middle. And so we can assume that there will be just changes back and forth over time, not always one for one. There might be little bits of variation, there. But for many of these policies to work, they require consistent, support over time, not just 50% of the time. So I think we need to look hard at, here in the United States, about how do we reframe or restructure our alliances so they have more of a bipartisan basis of support and are clearly sort of in America's interest. That might be something to do with foundational technologies and strategic competition. It could be to do with AI. It could be something, else. I think we need to look at that. And I think our allies and partners, need to do some of what they're doing now, which is to try to build up their national strength. So they are not sort of completely, I don't think they are completely reliant on us at the moment, but so they are less, reliant on us, because I think what we have in common, means that those relationships will be strong, even if they are more sort of independent militarily and strategically. Thanks. Well, one more? Or, I think it was, oh, sorry, wherever.
Hi, my name is Hampton Dowling. I manage my own consultancy. Just curious, the British ambassador of the United States was over at the Atlantic Council this morning, and his assessment was 180 degrees different than yours about the alliance and Indo-Pacific relations and focus of the U.S. And I think it was just the past 2 weeks, you had the Prime Minister of Australia, and then you also had, same with Japan, saying it's a breath of fresh air with the U.S. approach into the Indo-Pacific region. And I'm not sure of any alliances that we're weakening and we're backing out of. You had the Secretary General of NATO just last week said the new administration's approach actually is more resilient and making it stronger. All these leaders are having an exactly different opinion. Where is this coming from?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can tell a lot by, I think this is how they need to play the game, right? I mean, the whole game is they come to the Oval Office, they say, Mr. President, you are, a unique sort of genius who's bringing great sort of value to and stabilizing the world. And, we need you not to impose a 60% tariff or pull the plug, and we support your leadership. So I think there's a lot of that's going on. I would say if you want an objective analysis, just look, at what we are sort of seeing, and look at the commitment in Europe. I think we've seen a real reduction in support for Ukraine that's made countries pretty nervous there. I think obviously we've seen attempts to forward sort of the unification with Canada that has really upset the Canadians. I think in the Indo-Pacific, we haven't really seen very much of what a China strategy or Indo-Pacific strategy is. And I think we've seen a hollowing out of some of the internal capacity here in the United States, particularly with the decisions taken on the National Security Council, last week that raised real questions about our capacity to be able to deal with the crisis over Taiwan or something else should it actually happen. So I think that's what, then in private, I think you hear anxieties reflective of that. But, I certainly hope you're right. I hope I'm being overblown and exaggerating things here. And actually these alliances are quite strong and improved. And that I think would not just be good for the administration, I think it would be good for the United States. So I think we'll see, over time. But I think we also need to objectively look at the actions that are being taken. Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom, very much for those remarks. And I'm sure we could have gone longer in the question and answer, but we have to move to our panel, our next panel, which will, if I could invite the panelists to come on stage. Dr. Eva Peshwa will be moderating this panel. So.
Right. Well, I think that was a brilliant introduction. Actually went straight forward into the topic, so it raised the bar for this discussion pretty high. I don't have to introduce myself. I run the Japan chair at CSDS, but I'm also one of the culprits behind this dialogue since, 5 years, 6 years, together with CSIS. And it's true, when I think back 5 years ago, the world was a completely different place. And the idea we had at that time, which clearly seemed to be a good one, was to provide an opportunity for the American, European, but also our Japanese allies to get together to compare notes on some of the common challenges, and there was plenty of them. And it seems to me that every year I keep adding a layer, and this year it's even more challenging and even more challenging. But perhaps, I guess it's fair to say that this year it is even more challenging. We have heard about some of the current shifts and turns in the U.S. Foreign policy that really has shaken the very foundations of the U.S. traditional alliances. So it's not just the challenges coming in the Indo-Pacific or coming from the Indo-Pacific that have changed, but the environment in which we operate and in which we have to tackle them that has become incredibly more complex and multifaceted. Now, we're always trying to see some of the silver linings. That's, I suppose, we're paid for that. We need to do that. That's what keeps us going. And clearly it does generate a new dynamic. It does potentially open opportunities for more horizontal cooperation among the US allies, to a need to kind of rethink our approaches to how to basically manage the world we're dealing with. And it's, of course, incredibly challenging. And I'm really happy that I'm not one of the speakers these days. So I'm glad we could bring here the best and the brightest from across the spectrum. So we really have all of the perspectives covered, starting with Max Bergman, who's the director of the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program here at CSIS. Max has been following transatlantic relations for, well, as long as I know, for sure. Since birth. We're born into it. Then joining us from Brussels, we have Dr. Benedetta Berti, who is the head of policy planning at the NATO Secretary General's office in NATO. Apologies for ruining your evening, Benedetta, but thank you so much for joining us from across the Atlantic. Then we have Professor Michito Tsuruoka from the Keio University, who is also the deputy director of the Keio Center for Strategy, one of the best Japanese observers of international affairs, joining us from Tokyo. And last but not least, Greg Pauling, director of the Southeast Asia program here at CSIS. So let me start with the beginning. Max, we talked about the impact of the transatlantic relationship on, and of course, on the interconnected it with the Indo-Pacific theater. When this new administration started a few months ago, you published a report where you look at some of the main, you call it the coming collisions, right? Some main points of frictions in the transatlantic relationship. Now, we're not too far later, but how do you assess some of those frictions today, looking also how Europeans react to them? And what are perhaps some of the areas that are some of the riskiest when we deal with the Indo-Pacific, or know how the transatlantic unity has been essential to send a common message. Clearly now the unity is less. So what is your views on that?
Well, I think the transatlantic relationship is going through a real transition. First, thanks so much for having me here at CSIS, but no, thanks for moderating the panel. I think the transatlantic relationship is going through a real transition. And I think one of the fundamental changes is that it used to be there was a real bifurcation from the security side to the economic and trade and technology and sort of domestic policy issues were sort of pushed to the side. And there was, the security relationship was basically protected in its own sort of protected tunnel. But the barriers now between the sort of domestic policy and security policy, I think, have been broken down. And you saw that with Vice President Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference, really highlighting the Digital Services Act as an area where there was profound disagreement. And I also think you have a sort of a split, between the Trump administration and many in Europe, where I'm not sure if we actually have shared values now, where I think the notion of Europe standing up for liberal values of democracy, human rights, and freedom. I don't know if the Trump administration would disagree that they don't stand for those, but I think much more of an illiberal direction. And I don't think they would say that they want to uphold a liberal international order, which is, the kind of inherent outlook for European countries. So you have a bit of an ideological split. And then you have real issues of tension. that are now going from the kind of sidelines of transatlantic relations to front and center on stage. And that's the Digital Services Act, the fact that the European Union regulates technology companies, and you have an administration where there's a lot of influence from Silicon Valley. And J.D. Vance mentioning the Digital Services Act repeatedly in his engagement with the Europeans. And how that's going to get resolved, I have no idea, because that is the law of the land in Europe, and when the EU passes laws, it's very hard to undo those laws. And our tech companies are scared to death that those laws are going to create a Brussels effect and essentially become the way that the world regulates American tech companies, because when the EU acts, others follow. Because the EU, despite the whole concept of the EU being slow and boring and nothing gets done, actually is a legislating machine. And when it legislates, it becomes the laws of the land. And then I think on just quickly, maybe on the security side, I think we have an administration that is reckoning with this dissonance that has existed in Washington thinking towards Europe for a very long time. And the dissonance is, on the one hand, we go to Europe and we're like, the trains work, things look great, this is a wealthy society. Why are we, America, protecting Europe? A very common sense reaction. And said, it's time for the Europeans to start taking care of themselves. And that, I think, is the fundamental reaction of many folks in the Pentagon, in particular, saying we need to focus on Asia. It is time for Europe to step up. But then we have all this influence in Europe. The fact that we, call the shots at NATO and European security, and ensure European security means that, Europeans buy all our weapons. That Europeans, are constantly coming to Washington, trying to be in our good graces. And do we want to give that up? And so what you see, I think, in this administration is a real split between the Defense Department and the State Department. The Defense Department's looking at massive troop cuts, while the State Department is saying nothing has changed, buy American. And that's a struggle that every administration has gone through, and most have gone on the side of, we don't want the Europeans to actually work together on defense. We don't want the EU to do defense. We want to do it for them because it gives us all this influence. And I think it may be time for a change and a shift, because we do need to focus on China, and Europeans need to focus on Russia, and that is fairly unique in the history of the modern transatlantic relations, where we have a different strategic focus. So I think the collisions are going to come on all sorts of things, on trade, as they're happening now, on tech policy, on climate policy when the EU implements CBAM in the beginning of 2026, and then how that manages, how those collisions are managed, and how do they then impact the security relationship, I think is a big question. But I think it's one where we're looking at a situation where the United States increasingly is actually wanting to implement a major shift in where it's focused and where its forces are, and that's not in Europe.
Thank you very much. Well, I think, there is a certain logic that we can all, in a way, agree with to a certain extent, that yes, Europeans need to build up their defense, and they will do that whether we like it or not at this point, and prioritize primarily in their region. I think that's pretty much a given. But of course, when it comes to China, it depends on to what extent China is a regional challenge or global challenge. And of course, not to forget that Europeans have their own Indo-Pacific strategy, have their own interests in the region, and will inevitably also pursue their own course, regardless of what is going on in Washington. But we can get back to China. Now, you mentioned, you focused about European defense, obviously, and I'm just very tempted to now turn to Benedetta, because when we talk about defense, when we talk about transatlantic relations, of course, the Transatlantic Alliance is what comes to our mind first. Now, you mentioned and the kind of almost altering the course, right, in the transatlantic relationship, in the Transatlantic Alliance. What do you see, Benedetta, now, if I may? What do you see the impact of these shifts in Brussels, NATO headquarters, of course? Do you see, we've heard about, of course, the pressure coming from Washington on increasing spendings. That's one thing. Ultimately a positive one. What's the debate now at the headquarters, especially ahead of the summit in just a few weeks to go?
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Eva. It's great to be with you. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Then I shall start. Well, I would say there is no doubt. I agree with the premise that the transatlantic relation is transforming, that we are in a transformational stage. Maybe I would slightly reframe it in the sense that I would say from a NATO perspective, we have been in a transition and in a transformational phase for quite a while now. And that has started really in 2014. So it's really the past decade. And that has been driven by a very powerful understanding, that being that the post-Cold War peace dividend era, where we could spend underdevelop our defense industry, spend very little on defense, that era really came to a rather abrupt end, and that we are now faced a security environment characterized by strategic competition, characterized by the fact that we have an open war on European soil. And to make a very long story short, because you all know what the security environment looks like, since 2014, from a NATO perspective, there's been a shift. And that shift is we need to go back to putting collective defense at the very center of what we do. So in a way, going back to the past. And that requires a monumental shift in terms of forces, defense spending, production capability of our defense industry, rebuilding a culture of defense in our societies, investing in resilience, mitigating strategic dependencies. And that trend really is ongoing. And when I look at the upcoming NATO summit in just a few weeks in The Hague, I can see that as being yet another milestone in that process of resetting our posture. Over the last year, as you know, we adopted new plans, then we adopted new capability targets. At the next summit, we're going to agree a much more significant or robust increase in defense spending. All of those, to me, are very much on the same direction of travel, making NATO stronger militarily to enable the collective defense of Europe as our core priority. That said, there's also, of course, another underlying trend that has been in play for a while now, and that is, of course, the rise of strategic competition, the rising importance of which nobody, I think, questions, of the Indo-Pacific theater, and the acute awareness that for the Transatlantic Alliance to continue to work, there has to be some level of burden balancing, burden shifting, and that requires European allies to do more, especially when it comes to the conventional defense of Europe. Again, this conversation didn't start a few months ago. It has been ongoing for years, but I would definitely say that in the last few months, there's been a quantum leap in terms of thinking about what additional capabilities we need to bring to bear as European to ensure the collective defense of the transatlantic area. Discussions about going from a minimum of 2% to potentially that 5% that includes a 3.5% in core military expenditures. So really, these are very, very significant shifts that I think ultimately contribute to, yes, transform the transatlantic relationship. They make it ultimately stronger and future-proof and also fairer. So to me, that's something that actually contributes to the national security interest of all the countries in NATO. It also responds to the need of the United States to prioritize the Indo-Pacific theater. And it also opens up cooperation opportunities, for example, on defense industrial cooperation between European and Indo-Pacific allies and partners. So I think there is a win-win case to be made. And I would also argue that actually transformation is a sign of strength to the relationship. And when in a couple of weeks, you will see heads of state and government coming to The Hague to agree what are essentially generational shift in our defense spending posture and a significant commitment to strengthen the transatlantic defense industrial base, because it is transatlantic with integration on both sides of the Atlantic. I think that is actually something that is to be interpreted as a strengthening alliance, not a weakening one. And last point, of course, as we talk about prioritizing and ensuring the collective defense of the Euro-Atlantic area, we're talking about forces, we're talking about capabilities, we're talking about a lot of catch-up that especially European allies need to do. But we're also talking about resiliency. We're also talking about critical infrastructure, cyber defense. We're also talking about issues that are really not just bound by geography in traditional sense. And that opens up to a conversation on strategic competition and mitigating vulnerabilities that are defense critical. I stop here. Happy to follow up on any points.
Well, thank you so much, Benedetta. That actually sounds all really encouraging, right? Quantum
Yes.
leap, future-proof alliance, strengthening everything. We have to see now if we'll manage to actually put it in practice in some of the conflicts that we're seeing in our neighborhood. But that, of course, remains to all be seen. We can get back afterwards to NATO and NATO's cooperation with Indo-Pacific 4 countries. But before we do, I was thinking of actually asking Michito, who's here as the Japanese voice, of his perspective. It could be also in relation to NATO or later. We talked about the frictions on the European side. Now, if there's one country that stands out as the most, safest, most robust ally of the United States today in the Indo-Pacific, it is Japan. We have been reassured over and over again, including during Secretary Hexat's visit a few months ago. How reassuring it is from Tokyo's perspective, given the fact that the rest of the region is perhaps even more volatile. I mean, we don't see that same commitment towards South Korea, for instance, etc. So how does Japan feel about being that most trusted alliance, and what does it imply? What is now on top of your to-do list when it comes to meeting the expectations that are coming from Washington?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here joining this conversation this afternoon. Yes, it looks that the status of the U.S.-Japan alliance looks, yes, they're better than NATO, but perhaps you can argue that the things look quieter than NATO. Whether that's really, that really shows that the status of the alliance is better, but at least quiet, meaning that there are sort of fewer problems, burning problems to be solved. But if you look at the security environment in which Japan finds itself, it's getting worse and worse and worse. So we tend to focus very much on China, but of course at the same time North Korea is there, and North Korea's capability when it comes to nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles are increasing. So, and also the North Korean soldiers are getting more sort of a real combat experience in Russia. And that concerns Japan and South Korea and other US allies and partners in the region a lot. So yes, the US commitment to Japan or to the Indo-Pacific region as a whole, yes, it looks robust, but that's because China is there. That's because North Korea is there. So Japan is not in an enviable position. So that's one thing I wanted to emphasize at the outset. And but still, you can see an element of feeling in Japan that Japan is too important to be abandoned. So to some extent, yes, it's true, given the fact that China is the biggest threat and challenge to the United States. Yes, the US has reasons to remain engaged and to remain committed to Japan and the US-Japan alliance, or South Korea or Australia. So it's not really a great situation that, for example, that in Japan that whereas in Europe that now there are so many discussions on Plan B, but in Japan it's just impossible to even think of defending Japan by itself without relying on the alliance with the United States. So this is just a reality. So when it comes to to-do list, I believe that nothing has changed. So because what Japan needs to do in security and defense has been sort of consistent. So whoever sits in the White House, that doesn't matter. Japan has been in a process of waking up to the reality in the region. So we have all known what Japan needs to do for some time. So nothing is new. So yes, the defense budget is one thing, but at the same time, the ISR capabilities, intelligence reconnaissance, surveillance capability, so and also the strike capability. So Japanese government is in the process of acquiring what is called counter-strike capability, so like Tomahawk missiles and stand-off long-range missiles. So these are the areas where Japan needs to step up. And so that's not going to change. But when it comes to defense budget, yes, the interesting dynamism is taking place. So when the Japanese government decided to increase defense budget up to 2% of GDP by 2027, so that was a Kishida government's decision back in 2022. At that time, the LDP, the ruling party, was saying that we see NATO's 2% target as a reference. Okay, so back in 2022, it was 2%, and that was a great reference for Japan. And now, assuming that NATO is going to say 5% or 3.5%, then whether it's going to be a new sort of reference for Japan or not. That's a huge question that the current government needs to think about. Yeah, because the current government or the previous government, the Kishida government, which decided to increase defense budget up to 2% of GDP, then the government has been saying that it's not a figure-driven thing. So it's just a result of a compilation of military need. And then that's 2%, happened to be 2%. But people in the foreign security policy community, experts, know that. No, this is very much a figure-driven thing. Because at the end of the day, politics is about allocating scarce resources, right? And the 2% or 3%, 5%, whatever, is an expression of the country's willingness to defend the country and also the expression of a commitment to national defense. So it's very much a political by nature. So the 2%, 5%, or whatever is a politically driven thing. So I think the question for Japan now is to what sort of a level of commitment and expression of commitment that Japan needs to focus on defense. That's a huge question. And finally, on something on Europe-Japan connection, the defensive equipment and cooperation is becoming more important. So just last month, the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte visited Japan, and he visited the Mitsubishi Electric, it is not really a factory, but the Kamakura Works, that's the research and production facility. And also the Mr. Rutte met a group of defense startups. And he met not only foreign defense ministers, but also economics minister, METI minister as well. And that shows really new, that shows something. And so the defense industrial cooperation, not only between Japan and NATO per se, but also Japan and individual European countries, particularly the UK, France, Germany, Italy. So it's really a new sort of a opportunity. And particularly the case in point is a GCAP, the Japan, UK, Italy, a joint project to develop next generation jet fighters. So, and UK and Italy happen to be NATO countries. So that means that Japan needs to learn more about NATO standardization, so NATO standardization agreements, and assuming that what we are producing is a sixth generation of jet fighter, which means that we are going to use new technologies where NATO standardization doesn't yet exist. So Japan is going to be in a process of shaping new NATO standardization in the context of GCAP, so which is really a new thing. So there are interesting developments between Japan and NATO and Japan and various European countries, but the point here is that it is a cooperation between US allies in Europe and in the Pacific region, and the importance of that, I believe, is going to increase in the coming years.
Thank you, Michito. This is precisely that sort of horizontal cooperation that I was alluding to, that of course started before, but is kind of getting a little bit more impetus as we go. And Benedetta, if you want to afterwards step in also on the NATO IP4 cooperation in that context, please do so. But let me conclude the first round with going south. But no, sorry to say, but we actually, I was really happy to hear Tom Wright mentioning the Global South, or for the lack of a better word, non-aligned movements. You've been focusing on Southeast Asia. It's a region that is very dear to my heart, and I keep going around saying, look at Southeast Asia a little bit more, pay attention to it for many years now. We know how strategically important, how pivotal it is to the U.S. China strategic competition, yet there seems to be, I mean, it's really not on the top of the priorities of the current government or the previous ones, let's be fair. How would you characterize the current approach? And I'm fully aware that it's an incredibly diverse region, but given its importance, what is the kind of main line of approach, and how is it perceived in this region?
Thank you, Eva. Thank you for front-loading all the caveats about Southeast Asia and the Global South, so I didn't have to. So I'm fresh from Manila. Not that fresh because it took like 40 hours because of a missed flight. So if any of this sounds like a hallucination, I apologize. But I do think there's effectively a Philippine policy, and then there's Southeast Asia. And that was true of the Biden administration as well. Like Tom, I don't love the term Global South, but in as much as it signals some degree of non-alignment, the Philippines is not part of the Global South, right? The Philippines is aligned with the U.S., Japan, Korea, Australia, at least in the Indo-Pacific, far more than it is with the rest of ASEAN. And that's not that's not just an artifact of the current administration in Manila. It started later in the Duterte administration and will continue as long as presumably China keeps up its behavior in the South China Sea. So the Philippines so far has probably gotten more good news than any other U.S. ally. I mean, there hasn't been a single speech or statement made by a Trump administration official that wouldn't have come out of the mouth of a Biden administration official when it comes to the U.S.-Philippine alliance. Secretary Rubio, Secretary Hegseth, then NSA Waltz, all had their first calls with any South Asian counterpart with their Philippine counterpart. Hegseth's first visit before he went to Tokyo was to Manila. We just concluded 2 weeks ago the largest Balikatan yet, which involved for the first time live fire participation by Japanese troops because Japan concluded its visiting forces agreement, what it calls the RA, with the Philippines. On and on and on. And on Saturday, we'll have Secretary Hegseth making a speech at Shangri-La Dialogue, where I suspect he's going to make a speech that's going to sound somewhat Austin-ish about partnerships and alliances, but it'll mainly be about the treaty allies. It'll be about Japan, Korea, well, maybe not Korea, Australia, Philippines, and a bit of Taiwan. Philippines aside. Then we have everybody else. And for everybody else in Southeast Asia, it's a much more mixed bag. There was a statement by Singapore's defense minister, Ng Hen, on the sidelines of Munich that I think still resonates across the region, in which he said, the United States has transitioned from a principal defender of the rules-based order to a destabilizing force and now a landlord seeking rent. And to the U.S.'s credit, most of the states of South Asia seem willing to pay that rent, but they don't do it with any love or affection. They do it out of necessity. On the economic front, Southeast Asian states have been particularly heavily implicated by reciprocal tariffs. After Lesotho, second highest rate in the world was Cambodia, third is Laos, fourth is Vietnam. Indonesia and Thailand are both in the mid-30s. Really only Singapore and the Philippines got off easy. Given the importance of Vietnam's trade with the U.S., you've seen the Vietnamese government battering down the doors here to try to negotiate. And they're doing it in a very transactional manner. They expedited the approval of Starlink in Vietnam by no coincidence. They fast-tracked the approval of a Trump golf course in northern Vietnam by no coincidence. And just last week, Eric Trump got to go to Ho Chi Minh City to unveil a new expedited Trump Tower in Ho Chi Minh. I suspect we'll also see things like purchases of U.S. military kit. Not everybody's being quite so eager to do these things, but the Indonesian government is also rapidly trying to come up with packages of basically non-tariff measures that would be attractive to the Trump administration. Cambodia, for whom something like 40% of its exports come to the U.S., has no choice. I mean, as much as you might think Cambodia is in Beijing's pocket, there is no Cambodian economy that doesn't involve imports from China and exports to the U.S. Malaysia has gotten more serious about negotiations after, I think, sitting on the sidelines for a while. And for all of them, what they realize is, in theory, we only have something like 5 weeks left before the pause on reciprocal tariffs runs out. There's 190-ish FTAs to be negotiated, and we've only finished one. So nobody wants to be left behind, and they realize that the Vietnamese are out in front. On the security side, those countries that already share U.S. anxieties about China, primarily Vietnam, to a degree Indonesia, are going to continue to engage pragmatically in the ways that are best for their own national security. But this accelerates moves toward diversification, which, depending on where you sit in Washington, could be a good thing. I talked about the Philippines diversifying security relationships with Japan. They've also negotiated new SOFAs with New Zealand. Canada will be completed in the summer. France underway. Similar efforts, to a lesser degree, from Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam. And the same on the economic front. So while countries batter down the doors here in Washington to negotiate their rent out of necessity, they're also looking at long-term diversification where possible. Not every country in Southeast Asia has an equal opportunity to do this, but both Indonesia and the Philippines are now bidding for entry to the CPTPP after staying out for 10 years. The EU and the Philippines have restarted FTA negotiations after a decade. We have investment and trade agreements between the UK or Europe and other Southeast Asian countries spinning up. And renewed efforts to elevate the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which includes China. So as much as countries can both get into the good standing of the US government, but also minimize future reliance on it, that is what they will do. The last point I'll make is we mostly talk about economic and security relations, but in Southeast Asia, and I think throughout the global South, one of the most important aspects of the U.S. China competition is the soft power aspect, the normative aspect, right? Getting countries who are never going to sit at your lunch table to agree with you more often than they do China. And that's about the power of attraction more than coercion. That's where we've really seen U.S. tools devastated in Southeast Asia. And not on purpose. I don't think the administration has targeted Southeast Asia, but has perhaps underappreciated that most of the tools they've attacked are particularly important in Southeast Asia. USAID, an obvious example. Shortly after USAID's dismantling, we had a devastating earthquake that struck near Mandalay in Burma. China got in right away. So did Russia. The U.S. First, I think they were sending 3 million, and then the embassy in Bangkok said, for who? You fired everybody. And they said, okay, well, here's 3 people, and we'll make it 7 million. And then they fired those 3 people, too. So the U.S. has been completely absent there. U.S. Institute for Peace, so much of its work focuses on Vietnam, on southern Philippines. That work has been paused, although hopefully will now restart. The attacks on the U.S. Agency for Global Media means that not only Voice of America, which recent survey showed was the #1 most searched foreign media outlet in Southeast Asia, #2 is Sputnik, has been effectively shut down in Southeast Asia. Radio Free Asia, who outside of China focuses mainly on their Burmese service, Khmer, Lao, Vietnamese, all shut down. Attacks on foreign students, and now the new pause on interviews is going to hit Southeast Asia particularly hard. If you look at foreign students in the US, it's China, India, then Vietnam. Philippines is very high on the list too. Coincidentally, Vietnam and the Philippines are the only 2 countries in Southeast Asia that in polling say that the US is their preferred educational destination. I suspect that will no longer be the case in 6 months. So I worry a great deal about, 5-10 years down the road when we start making kind of normative asks. Hey, how about you support our preferred standards, our preferred institutions rather than China's? We're going to find a great deal of the attraction of those arguments having accidentally diminished.
Thanks a lot, Greg. And you went ahead because that was my follow-up question. Because that's
all right,
exactly.
I'll see myself out.
No, it is. That you've covered that more than amply already, and it was about Chinese influence and kind of the possibility that seems to be kind of, in our faces, obvious, that China will not hesitate to use the frictions among allies to kind of increase its charm offensive. And I realize that the time is running out, but just a very quick follow-up on that one particular point. To kind of all of you, although Greg has already covered it, in the European case, I mean, we hear it a lot, of course. We know that the public, the general public, not necessarily the leadership, but the public is kind of sensitive to, in democracies, given the kind of popularity rating among the democracies of the United States going kind of downwards. Yeah, do you see a trend in Europe kind of altering its course on China? Or if I reverse it, actually, how can we still be useful to the United States interests in dealing with China as Europeans?
Well, it's a really good question. I think if you looked at the Munich Security Conference, you had J.D. Vance's speech, and then you had Wang Yi, Chinese foreign minister, talking about how China believes in a rules-based international order, clearly speaking a lot of the language that would be quite attractive to Europeans. He left out the word liberal rules-based international order, but that China believes in trade and win-win cooperation in contrast, as they were implying to the United States. A fairly overt effort. I think there's, on the one hand, there's sort of the foreign policy hand in me says, okay, Europe is going to try to hedge, that the transatlantic relationship may be dying. They're going to go to China and see what sort of deals can be struck. And I think in some ways that there's some truth there, but there's some real challenges. And the challenges are, number one, China is a major supporter of Russia and Russia's war against an EU candidate country in Ukraine. That is a huge obstacle. The second is that the Europeans, American perception of Europeans are just that they're highly naive, have no idea what's going on, and they need America to tell them, what's happening in the world. And Europeans are much more clear-eyed than that. Maybe not as, we maybe tend to think of it as a year or two behind us, but when it was Ursula von der Leyen who invented the term de-risking, a kind of a better concept than I think the decoupling that then was sort of being discussed. And Europeans were quite clear about what China was doing to their companies, what China was doing, the influence efforts of China in Europe, China's wolf warrior diplomacy. And then when you now ask the economists, well, is Europe going to make an economic deal with China? And sort of what sectors, right? They're major competitors in the clean tech area, which is a major focus of European manufacturing. Automotive, the Chinese are wanting to go and eat the Europeans' lunch in terms of car production. So I think there is some room for cooperation, but clear-eyed cooperation between the Europeans and Chinese. And I think the Europeans are not going to take as sort of perhaps a bombastic tone as the Americans, at least how the Europeans would see it. But I don't think there's sort of room for kind of some great new effort at cooperation. What I would say about Europe's role from a U.S. perspective in the Indo-Pacific, and this is where maybe I sort of disagree with Tom somewhat and am sympathetic to the administration, I do think that one of the things that has to be recognized, and it's been very difficult for the United States, is that we have different strategic focus from our European partners now. When Tony Blinken first went to NATO in the spring of 2021 at NATO headquarters, he mentioned China more than 10 times. That China was the major threat, and he mentioned Russia only 4 times. And the notion, I think, was, well, NATO follows us around, NATO does what we want, European allies should get that this is our strategic threat. And then post-Russia's invasion, recognize that that actually doesn't work. We want to focus on China, but Europeans have to stay focused on the threat posed by Russia. And that doesn't mean Europe doesn't have a role, but this sort of notion of Europeans following America off to the wars that we're fighting, whether in Afghanistan or elsewhere, I think needs to be nuanced, number one. And the second thing I would say is that we forget that the European Union is an economy the same size as the United States and China, that Europe has a huge interest in a free and open Indo-Pacific, in stability in the Taiwan Straits, and that, if there is a war between China and Taiwan or China and the United States, it deeply affects the Europeans, and that as the Europeans mobilize their defense industries, and if Benedetta is correct and everyone signs on to 3.5%, 5%, well, you're about to have a massive amount of European defense investment, and you're already seeing that, which will eventually hit excess production where they're going to want to sell a lot to allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. EU now has a whole big security assistance tool, the European Peace Facility. It's being used for Ukraine. Eventually that could pivot to the Indo-Pacific. So I think there's a real defense industrial role, Europe's normative role in terms of upholding the liberal international rules, don't invade other countries or territories, as well as the economic role that Europe plays.
Okay. Well, we'll try to stick to that. Benedetta, a few words on NATO IP4 cooperation. We hear that, the current administration endorses very much the direction of NATO has embarked on incorporating with AP4 in deterring China. How do you see that evolving? Is that going to be the next major focus of the alliance? Do you see, obviously, more cooperation, but perhaps different kind of cooperation with the IP4 partners?
Yeah, thank you. No, to go back to the main point, as with NATO really putting the focus on enabling the collective defense of the Euro-Atlantic area, this is very broad concept. It means forces, it means capability, it means resiliency, critical infrastructure, supply chain security. In other words, it is not a concept that can be fully implemented without considering and enhancing the relationship we have with key partners, and especially our Indo-Pacific four partners, so Australia, Japan, the Republic of Korea, and New Zealand. So in that sense, there is no incompatibility between a NATO that is sharply focused on enabling deterrence and defense and a cooperation with key partners on issues such as defense industrial cooperation, defense innovation, how to maintain or preserve our technological edge in a time when it's more and more aggressively contested. Enhancing cyber security and cyber defense as we face persistent threat actors. There are a number of issues where cooperation between Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic partners strengthens NATO, strengthens security in both theaters, and does that while recognizing the different problem sets and priorities of both theaters. So in that sense, I really don't see contradiction. To the contrary, and that's why I think there is broad support to continue in our strengthening of that defense industrial cooperation, work on innovation, work on cyber security and defense. And all of that also, just to conclude, but to go back to the point made before about what the PRC challenge is in a context like NATO. When NATO says that our core focus is ensuring the territorial defense of Europe and the collective defense of allies, of course, we're doing that in a world of strategic competition. We're doing that in a world in which our strategic dependencies are weaponized against us, in which there are persistent cyber attacks and hybrid operations against allied security. And that's why, from a NATO perspective, when we talk about a PRC, we talk about a systemic challenge to Euro-Atlantic security, so bringing it back to our core focus. So in other words, I really see there is a lot of complementarity between these two strengths of works, and actually strengthening both theaters. There are some cross benefits in terms of deterrence effect and also defense of the homeland. So there is a win-win case yet again. I'm afraid I am the European in the panel and the optimist on the panel today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Benedetta. We need more of that. Michito, do you want to add something on NATO IP4, or well, you already covered a little bit? I wouldn't call it a plan B or C or plan E, perhaps, cooperation with Europe.
Oh.
But we know it's not perhaps enough, and clearly it's not going to, be an alternative or whatever. It is one of the supporting things. But What would you see? I mean, there's a lot of discussion of kind of coming with a coalition of like-minded countries in some of the more, real strategically important issues, raw materials, economic security, whatever, technological cooperation. What do you see? And this will be a last round before we open up to questions, because I realize that we only have 20 minutes. But where would you see the biggest strength of cooperating with Europeans on those issues from Japanese perspective?
Yes, thank you very much. There are various formats to think about. So of course, NATO, IP4 is one thing, but from a Japanese perspective, of course, the cooperation with the EU is also quite important, not only in economic terms, but also in political security terms as well, and cooperation with individual European countries. So another very important aspect of this is how we could get the UK involved in EU-Japan conversation. So now it's really good news that the EU-UK relationship is getting better, which is in Japan's interest as well. So that's one thing. But broadly, in strategic terms, the common challenge that the Europeans and Japanese and Australians, Koreans share is the need to prevent simultaneous crises and simultaneous contingencies in Europe and in the Pacific region. So the Taiwan contingency, and if that Taiwan contingency and the Baltic contingency happen simultaneously, then that's going to be a nightmare for everyone. So Americans, Europeans, Japanese, and the Asians. So how we could prevent that. And for that purpose, the Japanese and the Asians need to pay attention to Europe, and vice versa, Europeans need to know what is taking place in the Indo-Pacific region. So that is why that we can say that it's in Europe's own interest to help deter China from invading Taiwan, and it's in Japan's interest to help deter Russia from invading the Baltics. So that is very much the core when we think of a NATO, Indo-Pacific, or the Europe, Japan, or Europe, Korea, Australia dynamics and connections.
The connective tissue that we talked about is there. We have 24 minutes for questions, and there's loads we have not covered. Taiwan was on one of them, and there's plenty others. So, because I suspected that there will be obviously questions from the audience. So please raise your hand and identify yourself, and you can just also say who you want to ask a question to. Gentlemen.
Thank you for speaking with us today. My name is Marcos Ramarilar. I recently graduated from George Mason University. So my question is to Mr. Poling and Tsuruoka-san. And I was wondering what Japan's role in the future of the South China Sea and Southeast Asia's defense and security policy is going to be in the future.
The Japanese policy on that?
Yeah, so from the Japanese perspective, I'd like to know what Japan is doing in the security sphere in Southeast Asia.
Thank you very much. Shall we take a collective view so that you have more time to think about them? Is there any other one? And then.
Thank you. My name is Mark from United Daily News. Actually, I have a question on the Ukraine war, because the last 4 months have been a roller coaster ride. Initially, the administration wants to end it in 24 hours, and then there's a drama at the White House, and then now Trump is, calling Putin crazy and playing with fire. I do think the administration want to end the war because they want to maybe shift their focus on the Indo-Pacific region, and that's probably why they don't have a clear strategy right now. But I'm just wondering how can the administration end the war, and what does Europe think of all of this? Thanks.
So I suppose that's a question for Max. Easy. And the third one.
Eric Lachica from U.S. Filipinos for Good Governance. This is for Mr. Poling. The recent article in the Foreign Affairs magazine on the Taiwan fixation, it made very specific recommendations that Taiwan should be more self-reliant, especially this spending based on GDP from 2.5% to 4%, and specifically the military preparedness. Apparently, I was surprised that the reserve forces in Taiwan, especially males, are only 4 months. The authors of that article recommended that the current administration condition military assistance on Taiwan achieving certain numbers, especially with anti-ship shoulder launch missiles. All of those things are part of the recommendations. I'd just like to find out if those recommendations are realistic and effective to make the Taiwan a true, have a true deterrent policy.
Okay. So we have South China Sea, war in Ukraine, and Taiwan defense. So I believe the first question is both. Perhaps we can start with Michito and Greg afterwards, and then Max will give you more. And up.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much for, when it comes to South China Sea or Southeast Asia, one of the most important pillars of Japan's approach is to increase defense capacity building assistance to various countries in the region, so particularly in Southeast Asia. So it is about strengthening the sort of a collective capability of the countries sharing values and interests. And I mean, when it comes to values, it is about rules-based international order. So this is very much at the core of thinking about South China Sea or the region as a whole. So despite the fact that now the talks about rules-based international order are somehow missing from the Trump administration's discourse, but Japan is very much still committed to this because it's very much at the core of Japan's national interest. So because Japan is a country which is not prepared to use force to achieve what it wants to achieve. So the rules-based international order, and for that to be maintained, of course, we need capability. So that is why that the capacity building assistance or even arms export, I think, are going to be more important. And in that context, the fact that the U.S. credibility is declining in the eyes of Southeast Asians, that is really a huge source of concern. So Japan needs to fill the gap, and at the same time that the Japanese is in a position to encourage Americans to remain engaged in South China Sea and also the Southeast Asia as a whole, as a region. Thank you.
Great.
All right, so on Japan's role in the region overall, during the first Trump administration, I think it's safe to say that Prime Minister Abe in Japan saved a great deal of U.S. credibility in the region, particularly in the Philippines, but not only there. That's a burden that I'm not sure Japan can take up this time around, given both the change in leadership in Tokyo, the change in the focus of the administration here, and increasing resistance, both limited resource in Japan and public resistance to the heavy amount of expenditure that Tokyo has traditionally spent overseas. I suspect we'll see a more disciplined Japanese approach to overseas development assistance and overseas security assistance in the region, which will not be able to backfill quite as much of the U.S. withdrawal as one might hope. I do think it will particularly focus on the Philippines, and I've talked about that already, but just today or yesterday, we had Eli Ratner's new article in Foreign Affairs calling for a collective security agreement between Japan, the Philippines, Australia, and the U.S. I will not weigh in on whether or not I agree with that concept, but the fact that it's in Foreign Affairs and it's not considered crazy tells you something about how fast the normalization of Japan's security role, particularly the Japan-Philippines relationship and what some like to call the Squad, that informal four-way relationship, has developed. I'll also note that I think next week we start exercise Kamandag, which is the multinational Marine exercise in the Philippines, and we will have Japanese and South Korean Marines doing live fire training next to each other in the Philippines. So I do think we'll see a greater Japanese role in the Philippines and focused on the South China Sea. Japan has always viewed the South China Sea and the East China Sea as a single littoral. Its interests vis-a-vis pushing back on Chinese revisionism aren't going to change no matter what happens here in Washington. On the Taiwan question, look, I'm not going to speak to what Taiwan's military spending should be. I think everybody knows that there is no level that you could reach that would change the asymmetry across the strait in the near to medium term. So yes, certainly everybody working on Taiwan, including in Taiwan, I think would agree on the need to spend more to increase readiness, to focus more on asymmetric defense. But at the end of the day, it still comes down to whether or not the U.S. is going to be there or the U.S. is. And I would also note that, as far as I know, the Taiwan Relations Act does not say that Taiwan has to spend any amount of money. It says the U.S. is legally required to help Taiwan defend itself, period.
Okay. Benedetta, do you want to step in on the Ukraine question, or do you leave it to Max?
I think you can start.
As the European on the panel, maybe I should take it, but maybe Max wants to.
No, you
take it.
go ahead. You go ahead.
I wasn't sure if you were preparing for it.
Yeah, I mean it's difficult to speculate because we're really still very much in the midst of the process. But if seen from this side of the Atlantic, what I would say, and we're having, as you may imagine, very, very robust conversations about this as NATO as well. There are some common. There is a common and strategic end goal that we are working together towards, and that is to have a durable, lasting ending to the conflict, one that would assure, and I would quote the recent U.S.-Ukraine minerals deal on that aspect, that ensures Ukraine is sovereign, free, and peaceful, and prosperous in the long term. I think this is a basic proposition that, from a NATO allies perspective, across the Atlantic, there is a lot of convergence towards. So the question today is, how do we get there? Which is by no means a trivial question. From Europe, a lot of the conversations are around, first, how to support Ukraine during the negotiations phase so that it can negotiate from a position of strength. And that's, of course, about continuing the assistance in terms of military, in terms of financial, in terms of humanitarian. And then, of course, as you know very well, there's also a more longer-term conversation, which is, in the event of a political settlement, how to ensure that Ukraine is in a position where it can deter and defend credibly. Part of this is about force development and strengthening Ukrainian armed forces. Part of it is about a broader discussion that is ongoing about security guarantees, where different European capitals are really meeting in these days to formulate a forward-looking plan in terms of how to contribute to longer-term Ukrainian deterrence, and this will, in my view, be through a multi-layered approach in terms of security guarantees. So everything is still very much developing. It's hard to speculate, but I think there are some clear points, including a clear strategic end goal and a clear value for Europeans to take a greater role when it comes to supporting reconstruction, supporting future force development, and providing assistance to Ukraine. Again, in the notion of a broader transatlantic burden shifting that I was referring to before. Those would be my 2 cents.
Thank you. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I hope I'm wrong, but I have quite a cynical take that these negotiations don't appear to be going anywhere. It doesn't appear that there's any interest on the Russian side to seriously sit down and negotiate. And in part because the U.S. has decided that it's not going to support Ukraine for the long term. There's no effort to go to Congress to get another $50 billion supplemental to continue U.S. security assistance. So right now there's a lot of military deliveries to Ukraine. That is money that was spent during the Biden administration, where contracts were signed with companies, with defense companies, and those orders are there, and the equipment's going to come off the production line and get delivered to Ukraine. But we're on a glide path down. So we are quitting Ukraine. The question is, are we going to keep sanctions in place? Are we going to keep doing the intel sharing? And are we going to keep deliveries going to Ukraine until they run out? So the question then is really for Europe, how does Europe fill the gap that is left by the United States? Can Europe fill that? And I think the answer is, the good news is that the Ukrainians are partially filling it themselves with massive drone production, and they've shifted their strategy from trying to win the war, trying to reconquer territory that Russia has illegally stolen, to just trying to hold on And it's much easier to sit and defend and let the Russians come at you and just kill them as they come. And so the Ukrainians look like they're able to really hang on. But the problem is that when you're in a quagmire of a war, and we know this from experience here in the United States, is that your instinct is not to get out. Your instinct is to look for a light at the end of the tunnel and to really drive towards that light. And what we've done is we've given Putin a real light at the end of the tunnel. There's going to be less U.S. engagement, less U.S. participation, and he's hoping that that will mean the war can turn in his favor. And so he hasn't really shifted from his maximalist goals. Now, I hope I'm wrong. I hope there's some breakthrough in peace talks. But I think right now we have a situation where both sides are trying to get the White House to blame the other for why the talks are failing. And then we'll see where we go from there. But the end result is that in 2026, it's going to be Europe that is going to have to be supporting Ukraine, where the United States is going to be just much less of a factor in the war.
Thank you. Well, we have exactly 10 minutes, so I guess there's time for a quick last round of questions.
So my question is for Mr. Poling. I appreciated your insights about the frenetic pace at which Southeast Asian nations are now trying to broker a trade deal with the United States. And my question is, as that process unfolds, are we seeing a greater deal of trade and economic cooperation between those nations as they try to insulate themselves from reliance on the U.S., or are we seeing more competition between them as they try to compete to see who can get the best trade deal with the U.S.?
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Benedetta, you briefly mentioned about like a CPTPP, but I was wondering in the relation between like Europe and like Asia and the US and Southeast Asia, was wondering what is like a probability of like Europe getting into like CPTPP, which like UK has recently joined.
Okay, and there was.
Very much. My name is Julia Salbert. I am a young graduate in the Master of Art in Transatlantic Affairs from the College of Europe and Tufts University, and also a former student of Professor Berti. Thank you. Very nice to meet you. I know that in the past, NATO have used maybe less traditional topic of security to build partnership with the IP4 partner. We mentioned an environment, also cybersecurity, but the women, peace and security agenda is also one of them. And considering the maybe changing US perspective on those matters, I am actually curious to hear Professor Berti, but also all of you insights on this topic, and if it's some initiative that we are likely to see continue in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, there will be a third round of questions. So if you have a burning last question, don't hesitate. I can exceptionally take 4.
Hi, my name is Dante Masucci. I'm a college sophomore studying international relations, and my question is for Mr. Poling specifically about the Straits of Malacca. A lot has been made about them, about how that's how China gets resources, food, oil, etc. in the past few years. And I'm wondering if the Chinese-Russian partnership has changed that importance by giving China a way to get food, resources, and oil and natural gas from a land-based route now, and if that affects the importance of the Straits of Malacca. So I'm curious what you think the relevance of them are now in 2025.
Okay, so we have, 2 questions explicitly for Greg on Southeast Asia, trade deal competition, the Malacca dilemma 2.0. One on Europe's accession to CPTPP, and the final round on women, peace and security for everyone. So how about we start with Greg, because you have most of them, and then we can kind of use the women, peace and security for everyone to just also conclude on everything, if that's okay.
Okay, sure. Let me start with the trade questions. Whether or not we have seen more coordination among ASEAN nations when it comes to the trade war, I'm afraid quite the opposite. The day before President Trump announced the 90-day pause on the reciprocal tariffs, we did have a special economic ministers meeting among the 10 ministers of ASEAN. They issued a statement that effectively said we're not going to retaliate, right? We're going to pursue a joint, cooperative, productive negotiation with the United States. I think that was basically the end of the cooperation, though. Malaysia, as chair, certainly might want to see more of that. There's just not a lot of incentive for individual members. You know, you've got on one end Laos, Cambodia, especially in Vietnam, for whom this is existential. On the other, you have Singapore, for whom it's a minor irritant because they have 10%. Philippines, who's actually probably more competitive with their 17% tariff as long as everybody else keeps theirs. So there's not a lot of shared incentive here. And a lot of the things these countries will be offering to the administration, critical minerals partnerships, for instance, are in some senses mutually exclusive, right? They're direct competitors. Their comparative advantages as relatively low-cost but high-skilled manufacturers and homes of critical minerals are identical. So they do want to not explicitly undercut each other, but make sure that they get in the door first. On CPTPP and Europe, there is growing interest and discussion of potential EU entry or bid for entry to CPTPP. The UK has opened the door there. The UK also proved that you can jump the line because China and Taiwan are waiting, but nobody wants to vote one way or the other on that. So the more they can stuff in front of that so they don't have to decide on China's bid, the better. I imagine the bigger hurdles would actually be the negotiations between the non-Southeast Asian members, right? The EU, Japan, EU, Canada, maybe EU, Mexico, EU, Australia on certain goods. I think Southeast Asia would welcome it, particularly as they seek, the big export markets, exporters like Vietnam, seeking to boost their only other viable market other than the U.S. in order to reduce their vulnerability to further U.S. tariffs. And all of this in the context that there's probably not a single government in Southeast Asia who assumes that any deal they cut with the Trump administration now will actually last the whole 4 years, that this is just the first deal they'll have to cut. And then they'll have to probably do 3 more, every year of the administration. On the Strait of Malacca, I don't have the numbers in front of me. My recently departed intern, Sophia, has done a study. I don't know what the numbers are. I would guess it's less than 10% of China's oil, particularly energy trade, you can actually get through either the Shui gas pipelines in Myanmar and the Northern Passage. So, no, I don't think there's any real viable alternative for China. But then again, I think the Malacca dilemma has always been more a strategic figment than a reality for both the U.S. and China.
Then I suggest we go backwards, then Michito, then Benedetta, and we finish with, or we should actually finish on a more optimistic note. So Benedetta, if you want to go last, then we can finish with optimism. So let's go Michito, Max, and then Benedetta.
Yeah, so Women, Peace and Security, WPS, that's been part of a NATO-Japan cooperation agenda. So Japan has been sending a series of the self-defense force officers to work on the WPS at NATO headquarters, and that I believe has been quite successful. And just on a quick note on the CPTPP, whether the EU can finally join the CPTPP or not, what is important is for the EU, Brussels and Tokyo, and perhaps Canberra, and these like-minded countries when it comes to trade, for them to maintain, keep championing the very idea of free trade. So that is really important, and the stakes are getting higher, particularly because of the fact that the U.S. is sort of absent from the central stage of the multilateral free trade system.
Yeah, on women, peace, and security, I think it's a real shame what's happening here. I think it was an incredibly important initiative when you're trying to maximize your combat capacity and combat power. You want to utilize your entire population and not sort of dismiss 50% of it. And also to take into account the interests of women and gender in a conflict environment is really critical. And this is where I think the Europeans, by continuing to talk and work on these issues, gain a degree of soft power around the world in how they're interacting with other countries. And so I expect NATO and European countries, European Union to continue with women, peace, and security initiatives. when it comes to the trade dimension, I mean, the EU is sort of running around saying everyone's going to get a trade deal. They completed a trade agreement with Mercosur in South America. The UAE, India is apparently going to be completed by the end of the year. There's been talks to Australia, talks about CPTPP. The real challenge with CPTPP is the EU didn't invent it. And the EU is so big, it doesn't like to join agreements that it didn't itself negotiate. And so that represents a really difficult challenge for the Commission, for the EU and Brussels, to say, well, we haven't set all the rules and standards here. We're used to being the big dog. And if the EU were to join this, I mean, it would be the anchor market that the United States was supposed to be. And I think what you would begin to see is the reordering of the global trading environment. No, I think it would be a real strategic breakthrough if the EU were to do it. Now, it may be that they do it more on, I think during the first Trump term, there was an agreement between EU and Japan. There was been talks between EU and Australia that were sort of paused last year. So I think that, the EU is a trading power in which you need 2/3 or a qualitative majority vote to approve trade agreements in the European Council, so they can do that. And I think that that's what we'll likely see over the next few years is a lot more EU efforts on trade.
For sure. Benedetta, you have the final word. So time for your optimism to close the session.
Well, I'll keep it very short because I also want to keep with the optimistic prediction that I will be out of my office by 10 p.m. So I will keep it extremely short and just echo what Max was saying on the focus that NATO has on security at large cooperation with partner countries. Julia, who asked the question, knows this very well. It's very tailored to the needs of both NATO and individual country. And so it's a very broad menu of cooperation. Of course, in an era where we are really putting front and center the need to spend more and produce more, we are focusing, and I think rightly so, on issues like the defense cooperation with countries like our Indo-Pacific partners, but it does not mean that we stop all other activities, and all the other activities, from the work we do on women, peace and security to the work we do on energy security, are very much tailored and focused on increasing operational effectiveness. So they also go back to our core mandate. So in that sense, I don't see any contradiction between a focused NATO and one that retains this diverse set of partnership relations. Again, all focus on the same objective, which is how do we remain militarily credible and maximize our operational effectiveness.
Okay, thank you very much, Benedetta. I'm afraid that the time is up. We have managed to cover an incredibly vast amount of issues, but of course, an hour and 15 minutes is super short. But thank you so much. I find it very reassuring in a way. I think it's almost like a group therapy. We should do this more often. That we do find more
in front of a crowd.
In front of a crowd. More things in common actually, and more to continue working on. Thank you. Many thanks to our speakers. First of all, thank you all for joining. Thanks to Benedetta. I hope you'll manage to get back home before, or at least leave office by 10. Thank you all for your excellent remarks, the audience for coming, those tuning online as well, and I hope that we will continue this conversation in one way or another. Thank you. And many thanks to you.